My name is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center at NYU's McSilver Institute, and I would like to welcome you to today's offering, Understanding and Treating the Complex Comorbidity of ADHD and PTSD with Dr. Roberto Olivardia. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone so you know how to participate in today's event. Upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the CTAC host, who will be able to assist you. If you would like to activate the closed captions, you can do so by clicking the toolbar button that reads Show Captions. We will also have a Q&A portion toward the end, but please submit your questions using the chat box at any point in time during the webinar, and we'll collect those on the back end. And now at the end of today's presentation, we do have a short feedback survey, and we would appreciate you completing it. Your feedback and suggestions help to inform our future offerings. And then lastly, the recording and slides for this presentation will be posted on our CTAC website, ctacny.org, within the next 2 to 3 business days. I do want to, again, thank you for joining us. We are very excited to have with us today Dr. Roberto Olivardia, a clinical psychologist, a clinical associate at McLean Hospital, and a lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. His specialty lies in the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Olivardia to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's great to be here with all of you today. Talking about this comorbidity of ADHD and post-traumatic stress disorder. As was mentioned, I specialize in the treatment of children, adults, adolescents with ADHD. I also am someone who has ADHD myself, and I'm the parent of 2 kids with ADHD, so I'm very familiar with it from that perspective as well. So in this, it'd be interesting just as a question to pose for people, what is a challenge for you when deciding on a treatment option for a youth that you may be working with who has ADHD and PTSD? And as we go through the talk, I'm hoping to just give you a lot of information about what we would see with this comorbidity and how to treat it. So first is just briefly, in terms of ADHD, we are talking about a neurodivergent condition that often is very, very misunderstood. The DSM even doesn't really do it justice, but basically we have symptoms that fall under an attention dysregulation, and in a way the name is a bit of a misnomer. It's not that people with ADHD lack attention. It's more of a dysregulation of attention. So if something is stimulating to someone with ADHD, their attention is right there, and in fact could be even better or stronger than someone who does not have ADHD. Sometimes we call it the hyper-focus zone. If it's something that's not so interesting, it's really difficult to pay attention. So I think of it as a neurotypical individual has like a dimmer switch of a light they can kind of adjust, because of course if things are boring to someone without ADHD, it might be harder to pay attention, but they can still regulate that or adjust it. Whereas to people with ADHD, it's a good old-fashioned light switch. Impulsivity is very common in folks with ADHD. Acting without really thinking, and that could be sort of verbal interruption. It could be impulsive behaviors, as we'll talk about throughout the presentation. Hyperactivity, which not everyone with ADHD fulfills the criteria for hyperactive, because you can have people who are what we call more of inattentive type of ADHD. However, hyperactive isn't just motoric hyperactivity in terms of moving around, getting out of your seat, that sort of thing. And particularly this is true for girls with ADHD who are vastly underdiagnosed, that we're conceptualizing hyperactivity also as a cognitive concept, that someone who might have very racing thoughts, very fast thoughts, almost like a hyperactivity of the mind, which can often be misdiagnosed as anxiety, or in the cases of older populations as mania. But for a lot of people with ADHD who might be able to control their behavioral impulses or might feel sometimes embarrassment or shame if they're getting out of their seat, and again, we see this particularly with girls with ADHD, but their minds might be just anywhere but in the moment. And executive functioning challenges are a core part of people who have ADHD. And basically, these are all the cognitive processes that our brain needs to do to get things done. And now, as you can see here, ADHD affects every life domain because our ability to regulate our attention, to monitor our actions, to be able to get data in present time of what we're doing, to then make decisions as to whether we should continue down this path or not continue down this path, to shift out of an action. Let's say we have to stop doing something in order to start something else. Those transitions are tough for people with ADHD. Being able to monitor activities. People with ADHD are drawn towards more stimulating activities, even if they're not particularly healthy or good for them. But even being able to persevere, to have endurance sometimes throughout tasks that require a lot of executive bandwidth can be very tough for individuals with ADHD. Managing information, processing information. And as I'm saying this, we'll talk about in keeping in mind when trauma is now intersecting with this already sort of vulnerable executive functioning system, we can see how it can sort of play and have a different dimension to it. How people manage and process information, their working memory, how they organize sort of like information together. All of these processes that people sort of assume are just kind of normal, natural processes are tough for people with ADHD. Managing effort, and a lot of times kids with ADHD get sort of being told that they're lazy or that they're not motivated enough, as opposed to understanding that it is cognitively very, very difficult for them to engage sometimes in certain kinds of activities that might require that level of effort and endurance. And emotion regulation, which is fairly newly conceptualized as an executive function. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that plays a part with ADHD. Other features, as I mentioned, with emotion regulation is a feature of ADHD is a difficulty with regulating lots of things, regulating sleep. Kids with ADHD are significantly more at risk for multiple sleep issues, sleep disorders, regulating food, regulating substances, video games. Again, it can have this very sort of all or nothing quality. I mean, as I say to my kids, to patients that I work with, as someone with ADHD, when we like something, we run the risk of liking it too much, too quickly. It can be very, very difficult, again, to rein that in. You'll see this, again, dysregulation come out in sensitivity. Sometimes kids with ADHD could be very hypersensitive to noise, to pain, to temperature, to various sensory elements, and also be hyposensitive to things. So I was a kid with ADHD that was hyposensitive to loud things. I'm a big music lover, and I like my music loud. And I am a big fan of punk music, which is very cacophonous, and that's very soothing and grounding to me. And then there are other things that I could be very hypersensitive and very distracted by in terms of noise and sound that to anybody else would seem far less overwhelming than listening to some of the music that I listen to. So it can even vacillate within an individual, certain stimuli that could be very hypo and hypersensitive. And even with pain, in terms of the regulation of pain, you'll see a lot of youth with ADHD that seem almost hyposensitive to pain and getting injuries and things like that keep them sort of going. And then other things that they might be very hypersensitive to. I think of ADHD in a lot of ways as an orientation to being externally oriented to what is going to stimulate me. And so there is a sort of external orientation to ADHD that easily runs the risk of individuals not always being mindful and present and being connected in their bodies. So I often conceptualize ADHD as a sort of like untethering or ungrounding, unless, again, we're super stimulated in something. Then we feel very, very grounded. But if that stimulation isn't there, there's almost this natural sort of ungrounded feeling of living with ADHD. Now, what's fascinating is what we know about the ADHD brain validates a lot of these experiences that those of us with ADHD have, and what we see with youth that we work with. We have all these neurochemicals in the brain. One of them is dopamine. Dopamine is implicated in reward and motivation. The ADHD brain, in a simplistic way, has very low levels of dopamine. So there's a dopaminergic deficit. Now, what that means is at baseline, an ADHD brain is pretty bored, is under aroused. Hence, this orientation to going in one's environment by what is going to ground me, what is going to stimulate me. In addition, GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, the ADHD brain has lower levels of GABA. So now you have an uninhibited, under-aroused brain. So we can see now the behavioral correlates to that kind of neurochemistry, but extremely validating for the ADHD community to have this kind of neurological data to know, okay, this isn't just a matter of willpower or bad behavior. We know that the frontal lobe, where all of our executive functions are housed, take longer to mature. Dr. Russell Barkley, who is deemed as the father of ADHD research, has done multiple studies and has said that for a lot of youth with ADHD, you have to think of them as sometimes being up to 30% less their chronological age and executive functions. And keeping in mind that executive functions is obviously very different than intelligence and intellectual capacity. So there's this real disparity that you can have. Let's say if you're working with a 12-year-old individual who could have the intelligence of an 18-year-old, but could have the executive functions of an 8-year-old. And that could be very confusing for parents, for clinicians, and obviously for the individual themselves. ADHD is highly genetic and hereditary as height and intelligence. I rarely have worked with a young person with ADHD that did not have at least one of their biological parents to also have ADHD. Now, ADHD rarely travels alone. And one of the things I always stress in giving these presentations about comorbid disorders, because I specialize in the treatment of ADHD with, you name it, kind of comorbid disorder, is ADHD gets very clinically underappreciated in clinical settings because the spotlight tends to be on the comorbid disorder. Someone has ADHD and depression, the spotlight becomes on the depression or the bipolar disorder, the substance abuse, the eating disorder, in other areas and the ADHD sometimes even just goes underdiagnosed, but not even diagnosed and identified. But I find even when it is, that the impact of it is vastly underestimated. And I've had many discussions with clinicians who sometimes sort of put the ADHD aside and think that it's just an issue of focus or an academic issue, or something that can't be seen as seriously as depression, for example. And that's not true. That we see it in a vast variety of comorbid disorders. So 50 to 60% of people with ADHD have a learning disability. And the most common one being dyslexia, which affects reading and writing and spelling. There's dyscalculia, which affects mathematics, dysgraphia, which affects writing and fine motor movements, nonverbal learning disabilities, which affect social cue processing. So now imagining a young person who has ADHD and then may have an undiagnosed learning disability on top of that. So their whole system of how they process information, if they're not getting the right support and help, can be very, very taxed, that system. About 20% of individuals with ADHD will have a mood disorder, depression, dysthymia, a bipolar spectrum disorder. 30% anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, OCD, which people think is very paradoxical with ADHD, but studies show up to 30% of people with OCD have ADHD. Social anxiety. I specialize in working with boys and men with eating disorders and see a very high prevalence of ADHD in individuals with bulimia and with binge eating disorder. In fact, the only FDA-approved medication for binge eating disorder is Vyvanse, which is an ADHD medication. Substance abuse. People with ADHD have 4 to 6 times the risk of any kind of addictive behavior. So that could be in the form of alcohol, cannabis, but it can be in the form of food, pornography, sex, gambling, self-harm behaviors. Sleep disorders, as I mentioned before, very, very common in individuals with ADHD, and PTSD, as we're going to be talking about today. So now that I gave you sort of just an overview of ADHD, let's dive a little bit more into this comorbidity of ADHD and post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are a number of studies that have looked at this comorbidity. I wouldn't say a wealth of studies. In general, because ADHD is often, I find a lot of times the research of ADHD tends to be siloed in terms of looking at the symptoms of ADHD and executive functions. They're probably in the last 20 years or so, we started to see more research looking at the comorbidity of ADHD in the presence of other disorders, and also how ADHD actually can serve as a risk factor for some of these disorders. Spencer in 2016 conducted a study and found that individuals with ADHD had 4 times greater the relative risk to normal controls of having a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, twice the risk when looking against psychiatric controls, and 1.5 times the risk against traumatized controls. Kevin Anschel in 2013, also looking at this, found that a lifetime prevalence of PTSD was significantly higher amongst adults with ADHD compared with controls, so 10% versus 1.6%, which is pretty significant. And other studies have also shown this, that there is a higher risk that having ADHD produces a risk factor of developing PTSD. And symptoms are more severe when people have both ADHD and PTSD than when people have either of these conditions alone. Now, why is that? What are the risk factors, and why is having ADHD provide this sort of risk factor for developing PTSD? So as I mentioned before, emotional regulation is an executive function. And what we know about the ADHD brain is that the way that emotions are even processed and regulated is different than in neurotypical individuals. Studies have found, for example, that in comparing people with ADHD to people without ADHD, and when they're emotionally provoked, and brain studies have looked at this, that find the amygdala, that good old part of our fight or flight, primitive part of our brain, gets activated and activated similarly, which is different than, let's say, in bipolar disorder, where the amygdala has an overactivation. With ADHD, it's activating similarly as it does to people without ADHD. However, the groups of people without ADHD found themselves to be quicker to soothe themselves from the emotionally evocative event. They were better able to distract out of negative affect, and they were quicker at connecting any potential emotional expression or response to a future consequence. So think about it with emotional regulation, how important that is, because we can feel something and we want our brain to say, well, maybe we shouldn't be yelling at the teacher because there could be a consequence to that. What we know with the ADHD brain is that it takes longer to soothe themselves from particularly negative affect. It's very hard. I mean, I always say it's ironic that we can get easily distracted in a lot of other things, except when we're feeling bad. It's very hard to get distracted out of that feeling unless we draw to something and are gravitating to something that's so highly stimulating, and often can be an unhealthy form of stimulation. And people with ADHD will often act on their emotions without thinking, and then later feel really bad and often regret what they might have said or done. Now, what's implicated in that emotional regulation is a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. And basically how it's conceptualized is the anterior cingulate cortex is a bit of a bridge, a communication bridge between the amygdala and the frontal lobe that basically says, okay, it kind of governs that amygdala to say, now, I know you're emotional. I know you're feeling something very strongly, but let's kind of soothe yourself. Let me connect you with all of the reasons why not acting on this emotion in an unhealthy way why that would work well for you. And here are ways that would be a better way of expressing this emotion. Well, what studies show is that the ADHD brain has a significant delay in that anterior cingulate cortex being activated. And if you imagine even in a 10-second delay, what damage can occur in how we deal with emotions, there could be a lot that could be said and done when we're acting out on our emotions. But even how emotions are processed to an ADHD brain, because there is this sort of like flooding, and especially if you have kids that might also have learning disabilities and also have very difficult times even organizing their thoughts in terms of all the executive functioning issues I mentioned before, even being able to name an emotion, to be able to be in one's body, to mindfully say, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I want to do with this feeling, and carry out that intention. And so you have emotions that at baseline can be very dysregulated, even in the absence of trauma. This is just an ADHD experience. And then, of course, when you now have a traumatic episode or issues with trauma, that it can lend itself to really tax an already vulnerable emotional regulation system. People with ADHD have poor working memory. And so even encoding things in live time is very difficult. Now, interestingly, people with ADHD can often have very good long-term memory, but it's sort of the in the moment sort of memory that with things like reading or even in conversations, sometimes following could be very difficult. So even encoding any kind of experience that's happening in real time could be very difficult in terms of what someone is attending to, what frame they're putting on that. And so we know that can make somebody at risk for having a very unintegrated narrative of an experience. People with ADHD have difficulty with shifting sets, so that when they're in a specific sort of cognitive mode, sort of shifting out of that mode to be able to sometimes gain perspective, or to be able to distance themselves sometimes from certain events. There's a term called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It's not a diagnosis, but it's a term that's used in the ADHD community of people with ADHD who already really connect to this experience of very high rejection sensitivity, to the point where it can almost be physically painful for people with ADHD. Now, one of the theories is that, for people with ADHD, I would say, everyone I know, including myself, we all kind of remember a moment when we were very young where we kind of knew something was different from how we were in the environment to how other people were. And what we want our youth to feel is that they are different, but that different is not defective, that different is not bad. It's just a different way of being in the world. But if you don't have that context or certain support, you already feel a little that differentness is risky, feels threatening. And then you have on top of that situations and events in which someone with ADHD might actually be rejected or ostracized. So there's a very, very high sensitivity around that. People with ADHD often have poor interoceptive awareness. And what that means is basically the mindfulness around what's going on internally in the body. So people with ADHD, for example, often confuse hunger cues and satiety cues. Am I hungry because I'm or do I want this food because I'm hungry, or do I want this food because it's just in front of me? Am I tired or should I be going to bed now? Or is it I go to bed when there's no more fun to be had, which was my philosophy when I was younger. And so even tuning in to an emotional regulation requires that interoceptive awareness. And if you imagine with trauma, that there's this real, this sort of approach avoidance conflict of being in the body has both sometimes this sort of very threatening perspective to it, and at the same time, as I'll talk about later, so much of the treatment of trauma and PTSD is somatic sensory awareness and being in the body and being mindful to feel one's empowerment and one's sense of presence. People with ADHD have a hypersensitivity, as I mentioned before, to some stimuli. And as we know with PTSD, that could be a common criteria for PTSD. Now, one of the things that we look at too is that people with ADHD, because of that need for stimulation, are often drawn to highly stimulating events and highly stimulating careers, and sometimes dangerous ones. But if you think even studies that look at populations of individuals who are more likely to have trauma exposure or develop PTSD, they are in sometimes occupations or careers that are in this category. Police departments, military, physicians who see death and see blood and see very, are exposed to a lot of traumatic events. And if you now have individuals with ADHD that tend to gravitate to those kinds of careers, you can see why you see ADHD and PTSD sort of more common than we would see in the general population. Now, what we also know is that people with ADHD, we have higher risk-taking behavior. I think back to when I was a kid. I mean, I did some crazy dangerous things that my adult self now thinks, oh my God, what were you thinking? But in that moment, I used to say, oh, whatever happens, it'll be a story, because whatever was stimulating was how we were oriented. And I told my kids a story the other day when I was 9 years old. I'm from Boston, grew up in Boston area. And there was this mall near my house when I was 9 years old. And, my parents would let us go to the mall by ourselves. It was quite a distance. And me and my friend, and he also had ADHD. We weren't diagnosed back then, but we definitely had ADHD. And I said, let's go to the mall. Like, let's be mischievous, because that was fun and stimulating. And so the shortcut to this mall was going underneath this bridge of Route 93 in Boston, which is like a major highway. And we go under this bridge, and there would be drug users, men who were injecting heroin, like under this bridge. And there was no part of me that was fearful of that said, I should not be here. I remember actually my friend said, we probably shouldn't be here. And we kind of laughed about it. And now I think back, that was very, very dangerous. I mean, who knows? Like, I mean, granted, we used to even say hi to them and wave to them. I mean, it's almost kind of darkly funny, but at the same time, it's clearly a situation that was not a safe situation. But there was no part of me that was like, this is not a cool situation. And again, keeping in mind that as I'm saying this, in no way, of course, that if something did happen to me, would it have been my fault? Of course, we're not saying that. But understanding that people with ADHD, and if anything, especially when I work with individuals with ADHD whose trauma is involved sometimes in these kind of situations that they see themselves as being a part of, that they then feel complicit in the trauma. And part of the work is saying, no, this was not your fault. And even if you were drawn to some of these situations because of the sort of danger of it or the impulsivity or whatnot, that still does not warrant any kind of trauma. And that's an important part, because a lot of times, as we know in trauma, that individuals can very likely blame themselves. And I find with individuals with ADHD and PTSD, they feel there's some validity to that blame, because they're like, well, like, what was I doing at 9 years old walking under this bridge? And here are these people who are kind of out of their mind. I mean, why would I kind of put myself in that situation? Well, yes. And it doesn't mean I warranted or was asking for any kind of bad thing to happen. And so it's so important to understand that to sort of separate that, because I hear that with youth and adults that I've worked with ADHD and trauma. Kids with ADHD are more likely to sustain injuries, again, due to impulsivity and a lot of that behavior, and understanding that even one's relationship to pain starts to get, again, dysregulated because of that. That I, would ride my bike. I mean, no one wore helmets back then, but ride my bike, flip over handlebars, bruise, scrape, bleeding, and whatever, just get back on the bike, and I would sort of be on my way. Like, it was almost like that wasn't even being processed. And so sometimes even in traumatic events that youth might sustain, even their processing of it as a trauma can take a lot of work, because they might be like, well, I didn't really feel pain in that, and therefore, is it traumatic or is it wrong? Does it mean that I enjoyed it in some ways? And so part of it is dismantling and helping them understand their relationship to pain in that way. And again, regardless of that, that they're still not, we're never complicit in those kinds of in trauma, but how somebody, especially if they're hyposensitive to pain, it can be very difficult to then say, well, is this bad if I didn't feel that? It's not like this other person who experienced that and was hurt and felt harmed by that. People with ADHD are at higher risk of physical and sexual abuse. And one of the theories behind that is, as I mentioned, ADHD is hereditary. So if you have a child with ADHD, they likely have at least one biological parent, if not sometimes two, that have ADHD. Now, most individuals with ADHD do not engage in any physical or sexual abuse of their children. However, if you have parents who have ADHD that is unmedicated, untreated, and where emotional dysregulation, dysfunction, substance abuse, all of these sort of variables are in the mix, then it might give rise sometimes to very abusive, dysfunctional behavior that now is kind of like intergenerationally causing trauma within the family. People with ADHD can often have poor self-esteem if, again, they don't have an understanding of their ADHD, or an understanding that there's nothing wrong with them. And sometimes, particularly with trauma, I've worked with youth with ADHD who have been abused, who've been sexually abused, and have sometimes felt that their perpetrator probably sought them out because they were someone that really needed and was looking for approval and looking for attention, because they didn't feel very good about themselves. And as we know, perpetrators target their victims and groom them in ways. And kids who are bullied, kids who might not have the most functional family, might be a very high risk for perpetrators selecting victims in that way. And sometimes with ADHD, not all the time, but it can create this sort of less integrated sense of self. And one of the reasons that having ADHD can also have put someone at risk for developing personality disorder is sometimes if you don't have, again, a narrative or an understanding of these executive functioning issues, of kind of your own behavior and feeling in control of your intentions, it can be very difficult to even understand yourself. And then, as we know, of course, trauma just completely can compound on that. So now, as we sort of understand a little bit more that comorbidity, we're going to dive into sort of the meat of this presentation, which is around treatment. And what do we do when people present with ADHD and post-traumatic stress disorder? So first, as I mentioned before, it's so important in screening for trauma in ADHD youth, and looking at, and asking about various situations of how safe somebody feels, whether, of course, there's any incidents of abuse, of bullying, of situations in which somebody really felt threatened in many different ways. So we always want to screen for trauma in any clinical population, knowing how there's obviously very unspoken, and there's a lot of shame in trauma, and the importance of screening for ADHD in traumatized youth. And ADHD often gets accused of being overdiagnosed culturally, and study upon study finds that that's actually not the case, that it's actually vastly underdiagnosed, particularly in adults, but even in children. And this is true, even there are a lot of racial disparities in the true identification of ADHD. Where in minority populations, you see a lot of underdiagnosis in certain ways, where it's sometimes not looked at as ADHD. And then in other populations, you'll see an overdiagnosis of ADHD, not taking into consideration trauma, or educational resources, poverty, things like that, that could also be affecting the picture. So we really have to just have this integrated picture, basically, of what ADHD, looks like, and how it could intersect with trauma. The biggest takeaway I always want people to get when I talk about any comorbidity is when ADHD is not treated and managed, it will undermine the treatment of the comorbid disorder. So in this case, we're talking about PTSD. When ADHD is not treated, if it's not identified and managed, it will undermine trauma treatment, as well as an individual's physical health. It will complicate the clinical picture when ADHD is not treated. And many times, unfortunately, with clinicians, that I've often heard this approach of, oh, well, we'll work or medicate or behaviorally work on the PTSD first and then deal with the ADHD. You're always dealing with the ADHD. The ADHD is along for the ride. It may even be the driver of the bus sometimes. So we always want to make sure that we're adequately giving it its true clinical focus. Understand the executive function demands of therapy and treatment. I mean, even the idea, for example, of I have 50-minute sessions with patients. I shouldn't assume that somebody can hold and regulate their attention for 50 minutes. I have ADHD. I remember what it was like being in classes when I was a kid. There was even a 30-minute class sometimes I was here, there, and everywhere. So giving people the space, especially, and then, even with people who experience trauma, that their ability to regulate attention, they can dissociate sometimes, to be in the present moment, giving people permission from the get-go of saying, look, if I say something and you spaced out, you've sort of kind of left the room for a little bit in your mind, it's okay. Just say, oh, I'm sorry, I just lost the last 5 minutes of what you were saying. Do you mind repeating that? Particularly with young people I work with, they often feel it's impolite to do that. They feel they're being disrespectful because it means that they weren't paying attention. And for folks with ADHD, we're told a lot when we're growing up that we should pay better attention, as with the implication that we're choosing not to pay attention. So it can be very almost seem very, again, disrespectful to tell an authority figure, particularly a therapist that you're working with, I literally haven't heard like the last 15 minutes of what you were saying. Sometimes that even the executive function demand of sitting in the same space. I mean, I have office where I'm like, look, if in the middle of the session you want to sit on the floor, we can both sit on the floor. We can switch around and switch seats. You can sit in my seat, I can sit in your seat. Just sort of just keep it sort of give motion and energy. I start, always with just a psychoeducation, and no matter what age group I'm working with, to share basically the information I just shared with you earlier today about the neurological basis of ADHD. I share that with young people. I just put it in language that's more digestible to them, but having them understand that this is not an issue of willpower, of weakness, or anything, that there is a sort of neurological element to this thing that in hopes, and I have found the overwhelming majority of people I work with actually find very validating. And I'm very open about my ADHD, and I see that as a very important tool, particularly in working with folks with ADHD who often feel very judged, even by clinicians that they've worked with, or misunderstood, that I get it. And at the same time, they're a different individual than I am with totally different experiences. And so there's going to be still a lot that they need to bring to the narrative. But I share that basis of ADHD and the neurological basis of trauma. That trauma, is this thing that, happens to people. And it's not just the psychological impact it makes, but now, we know in the last 25, 30 years, this sort of more emerging and research looking at that there are neurological impacts that occur with trauma, and particularly with the developing brain. So with young people, I've worked with some people who might say things like, I feel like I was oriented one way before the trauma, and then afterwards I'm kind of in another way, to help them understand that sometimes there are those sort of impacts. And at the same time, it's not that their brain is damaged. We have to sort of work with that. emphasize that it's not their fault. It's not their fault that they have ADHD, and certainly not their fault that they experience and had trauma. And we always want to address the role of shame with both ADHD and PTSD. So when people have both of these together, there could be a whole dimension of shame attached to it, in terms of the sort of like, why can't I do this? Why can't I keep my mouth shut like other people can? Why do I act on my impulses? And then, of course, the role of shame of experiencing a traumatic event or series of events where kids will internalize that. Always want to be mindful of cultural frames of the individual. Particularly, I'm always interested in looking at these issues through culturally competent lenses, how even ADHD is looked at. I mean, with certain populations, it's looked at as an indictment of the parents. And I always have to, sometimes the psychoeducation is with the parents to say, no, you didn't do anything wrong to give your kid ADHD, that this is sort of just, they were sort of born with it. But your parenting of that kid with ADHD will have to be adjusted, than let's say the kid that you might have that doesn't have ADHD. And part of it with both ADHD and PTSD is teaching assertiveness skills and self-advocacy. A large part at the beginning really is around mindfulness and grounding exercises. As I mentioned with ADHD, we kind of already feel like we're levitating on some level, unless we're super stimulated. With trauma is an incredibly ungrounding experience. It unanchors people. It sort of uproots them from all that they know that are familiar and safe and feeling secure. So a large part of the work at the beginning really is, before we even kind of delve into ADHD, PTSD treatment, is recognizing the power of the present moment. And how do we just kind of tune into our bodies where we have our biggest sense of security, stability, and safety when we're in the present. Now with trauma, the present moment can feel risky, as I mentioned before. It's like, oh, if I'm in my body, that means I can feel stuff. And sometimes I don't want to feel things. So it's reorienting that individual to say that when we feel things, that's when we can almost grab hold of them. And then we could kind of manipulate it and shape it in ways that then can be healthier for us. But if we're not in our bodies, we're really at a loss. There's nothing to grab onto. It's this amorphous thing, and now we're like the feather in the wind. Within mindfulness is also self-compassion and being very kind to oneself. What is the self-talk that somebody has around both their ADHD and their PTSD? Because it can get really, really bad. I mean, it's painful to hear of particularly young people I work with, and just the negative dialogue or monologues that they have in their heads around, I'm so stupid, I'm so weak, that even with traumas that they experience, even if they know that the trauma wasn't their fault, they might still have a lot of judgment around, like, why they haven't gotten over it yet. And this sort of pressure and a lot of that negative self-indictment. When we're mindful, really tuning into our senses. What do we see, hear, taste, touch, smell? That puts us in the present moment, and we feel our most empowered when we're in the present moment. So connecting to our five senses, teaching deep breathing techniques, the DBT techniques, as I'll talk about later, like holding an ice cube in each hand to sort of ground somebody in their body in the moment, which again, to even someone with ADHD can be a very foreign experience. And then certainly with trauma, can also be very difficult, and having them be able to see that is safe in that way, to be in the present moment. Creative outlets, music and art, body movements, walking and hiking, sports and exercise, all can be very grounding. Observation games, sometimes, particularly with trauma, where people might engage in some dissociation. It's sort of like, okay, I'm in my environment. Let me name everything in this environment that's blue. Okay, there's a blue chair, there's a blue pillow, there's a blue flower, just to kind of keep someone connected, almost like gamifying it for young people. Having mantras or self-compassion statements. What would they say to a friend or someone that they really cared about who was going through this? And humor can be a very therapeutic tool. And humor not as a way of invalidating one's ADHD experience, one's trauma experience, but really putting it in perspective. And I would say in general, as a population, that folks with ADHD tend to really take well to this. I'm a huge fan and lover of stand-up comedy, and my favorite stand-up comics are individuals who talk about very painful, dark stuff, but are making you laugh like very deeply, and not in a way that self-deprecates them, but actually in a way that gives it levity, so you're able to engage with the material of what they're talking about a lot more. And so using humor, and of course with trauma, it's not making light of the trauma, but particularly with ADHD, and finding even pockets of where can we find humor just in our world and our environment that can produce some levity. And humor puts us in our bodies when we're laughing. I mean, there's nothing better than like a real hearty laughter episode that we have, that we feel so in the moment for. Now with ADHD, with youth, we also want to make sure they're getting their proper academic accommodations. And why this is so important, even in, and I put this as treatment for the ADHD and PTSD comorbidity, is if you have a child that's not getting what they need in terms of their academic environment, then they're going to experience failure. They're going to have low self-esteem. There's going to be ostracized. They're at higher risk for dropping out. And then that makes any processing or dealing, managing, treating trauma almost impossible. So you want as much stability as we can provide for that individual to even then be able to deal with the trauma. And with ADHD, again, we have to always keep that in the zone, making sure that they're getting the academic needs that they have, whether it's on an IEP, getting different instruction, or accommodations. Extended time on tests, testing in separate quiet places over several sessions, being able to record lectures, audio tape, or now they have a lot of textbooks and digital books so that can read to a child, assistant with writing notes, all of these things that just helped a child feel more successful. Certainly with older kids, I work with high school kids, college students, making sure that professors, that they have that sort of dialogue and advocacy with teachers, and registering for disability services when they go to a college, reduce course load. A lot of times students, really, this could be met with ambivalence. They feel shame. They might feel like it's a crutch. They know, some of the students I work with know they need it, but they don't want others to know about it. They fear that they're imposing on teachers or professors, or they fear it will somehow be weaponized against them, that they're using these academic accommodations. And we want to normalize that for students. Executive function coaching, which is very much a part of ADHD, but again, very much is so important in when you think about PTSD and trauma, is if you're enabling someone better tools to execute their intentions, to feel more successful, to feel more in control, these are all empowering traits that then set somebody up for better success in the trauma treatment. And so to understand that when I'm talking about executive function coaching, we're talking about ADHD treatment, but is so important in rooting somebody in a way that makes them feel strong enough to be able to deal with all the therapy work that is involved in trauma. And basically with executive functioning coaching, we're externalizing that frontal lobe to try to give people strategies and tips that just don't come naturally internally. Breaking down larger things into smaller bits, making things more visual, posting schedules, having fidgets to enable someone to regulate their attention better. Something called a body double. Studies show that kids with ADHD do better in doing a task that they don't enjoy doing when they're in the presence of just having someone in the room. They don't even have to be doing the same task with them, but we call it like a body double. It's almost like they anchor them a little bit more in that room or that task. 10-minute rule. A lot of times it's the executive dread of, oh, this thing is going to take so long, and we're so distracted by our discomfort with it that sometimes saying, you know what, let me set a timer for 10 minutes and just do it in 10 minutes. And even something that's dreadful in 10 minutes could feel doable. And then, of course, once someone's in a task, it's a lot easier to continue that. There's a lot else I can say about executive functioning training, but basically to just emphasize the importance of that and teaching that and knowing that that is part of the trauma therapy. Because again, you want that stability and that foundation to be able to do some of the other work that I'm about to talk about. So the other piece that after the psychoeducation and doing some executive functioning work, is sort of more of a narrative-based therapy for trauma. Telling someone's story from the beginning. And part of trauma treatment is recognizing, of course, that trauma is this very, very impactful event or situation, because trauma, again, for a lot of people is not a singular episode. And at the same time, putting it in a perspective to a person is more than their trauma and more than their traumatic episodes. So having a narrative of who are you from the beginning, what are your likes and dislikes, and then integrating that the trauma is part of that experience. But the goal really is to go from this sort of bigger picture of who somebody is, and then understanding that the trauma is part of their story. And it's not invalidating that it could be a very impactful part of their story, but they are this fully formed person. And the trauma might have altered a little bit of that fabric and sometimes strongly alter that fabric, but we want someone to feel very empowered in their identity and not have the trauma be sort of dictating to them who they are. And there is an exposure element more for not the content. A lot of times it's not even that they have to recollect the trauma in painstaking detail. It's more around understanding the emotional toll and how the impact that it felt that they made on who they see themselves to be today. And so sometimes in doing this narrative therapy, youth will get very connected to their emotions. And we want them to look at emotions as safe, that there's any emotion that they feel is valid, and that they're in a place now that there's safety and feeling that emotion and expressing that emotion. Integrating sensory data to the content. We call like hot memories or the emotional content of our memories. Cold memories are more the kind of concrete, factual, intellectual part. And sometimes that can be very disconnected with trauma. Sometimes you'll have individuals that could sometimes even narrate their trauma, but in very factual content, and it's divorced of the emotion. And other times it's just pure emotion where they don't remember all of the details, and they don't really have to remember all the details. They know that generally what happened, and it's the emotions that are sort of more pushing the story. And eventually we want to kind of integrate that to, okay, these emotions are rooted in something valid. Again, we don't have to go into the detail of this, exactly like what happened in that kind of detail necessarily, although some treatment does have that kind of traumatic exposure element to it. But it's also understanding this rage that you're feeling is not crazy, that this rage is rooted in, this cold memory, this factual memory of knowing that there was this violation and this betrayal. And similarly, when people have sort of more the factual memories, it's like, okay, how would you feel? And you're trying to sort of induce in some ways an emotional content, because we know it's there. It's just compartmentalized. We want to focus on the resilience of the youth to survive the trauma. That's a huge message we want to get through, is whatever trauma they experience, they survived it, and the fact that they're working on it, that there's amazing resilience and strength in that, emphasizing supports and positive relationships they have, and never to overestimate or underestimate the impact of trauma. And I say this because sometimes, especially as clinicians, we hear some of these stories and think, oh my gosh, how does this not completely define a person's life experience? And sometimes for patients I work with, they're like, yes, that was bad. And they're not compartmentalizing their emotions. They're like, but, I can kind of put it in its pocket and see it for what it is. And sometimes it's not even the actual trauma that could be the most traumatic, as much as sometimes the reactions to that trauma. Or in the case of if trauma took on, into a legal dimension where a perpetrator was being tried and convicted, and that whole process can be sort of even more traumatic for some victims. With ADHD, we also want to have a positive identity of having ADHD. What is the use, view, and philosophy of ADHD and learning? We want to promote the idea that everyone learns differently and to accept that ADHD brain. Sometimes you hear in the ADHD community, it's a gift. And other parts, it's like it's a curse. And I look at it, it just is. I say to my patients, I think of ADHD as like a coin, the heads and the tails, you can't separate them. So I attribute a lot of my successes and the things I've been able to manifest in my life, my creative problem solving skills, my very vivid imagination, to my ADHD. And I credit the not so great moments and dark moments in my life to the ADHD. That is just kind of part and parcel of the whole experience. We do have to accept, though, that we have to do things that other people don't always have to do to get things done. And it doesn't always have to be harder. It's just different. And again, using humor as a tool. I mean, there are times that it's just funny. I was saying to a young patient of mine that in graduate school, I'm not a fast reader. I probably have a mild dyslexia, and I fatigue very easily when I read. And I discovered, I'll make the long story short, but I could read better on the subway in Boston going into the city than sitting in my apartment at the time. And so on Sundays, I would just ride the Orange Line in Boston up and down for hours and get through hundreds of pages of reading. And I said, my peers thought it was weird, and it was weird. And I was in on the joke. I mean, I was like, hey, whatever works. And we kind of have to be our own detective and figure out what's going to work and have a growth mindset around it. And our goal is to understand how we learn and execute optimally and not have can I do this as much as how can I do this? How can I get this done? We want to work on that negative self-talk and develop what I call, instead of an IEP, the individualized education plan, an IPP, an identity promotion plan of understanding the ADHD and being able to articulate that and advocate that. And that's a skill for young people that's so important, not only advocating in academic environments, but in relationships, that with friendships, if they are seen as being rude because they're interrupting all the time and they're not meaning to be able to say, I'm really sorry, this is just part of my ADHD. And it's not an excuse, but there's a responsibility when we have ADHD to be able to work on it, but at least to give context to a friend or in a relationship to help them understand that I'm not interrupting you because I think what you're saying is stupid. I'm interrupting you because if I don't say what I'm going to lose it, because I'm going to literally it's just going to go out of my mind because my working memory is so poor. I have to work on that. But I want you to know that. And that goes a long way of sort of promoting advocacy skills and having someone have a more strength-based identity. Now, with some of this is going to be, not news to a lot of clinicians out there. DBT is very, very helpful. And as we know, started with self-harm behaviors, borderline personality disorder. Studies have shown it empirically useful for virtually everything. I mean, frankly, I think life, anyone who is living life could benefit from DBT. Mindfulness skills of understanding that emotion mind, that logical mind, being able to observe experiences. And again, you can see how through the lens of ADHD that's useful, and through a trauma lens, how useful that is to be able to have perspective on something and say, okay, I'm observing this thing happening, and not to have judgment over our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, and be able to sort of get data from that to say, okay, so even though I did this very risky behavior, let me not judge it. And at the same time, let me sort of understand where that came from and what was driving that. Again, 5 senses technique, all of those sort of mindfulness skills, distress tolerance, having acceptance that we're going to feel uncomfortable. And both with trauma, with ADHD, I always say to the kids I work with, if we have a beach ball and we put it underwater and hold it underwater, we let go, what happens? It's going to shoot up like a geyser. If we just put the ball on top of the water, it's there and it's kind of staying there. And that's kind of with our emotions. We have to accept if we're feeling sad, We have to accept that, because if we don't accept that we're feeling sad, that could turn into depression. If we don't accept that we're angry, that can turn into rage. We don't accept that we're anxious, that can turn into panic. All of these very uncontrollable manifestations of emotions. Engaging in positive activities in which people feel that they're contributing to others. I mean, animals can be very, very therapeutic in that way. That helps with empowering oneself when you see yourself as a vehicle of change and as positive impact. And particularly with both ADHD and PTSD, you have youth that can often feel damaged and can feel that they don't serve a purpose, that they feel like failures in lots of ways. And so engaging in positive activities and advocacy work and whatever they care about to make them feel like, no, I am an agent of change to the environment and, of course, to themselves. Intense sensations can help distress tolerance and, of course, safely. We don't want people harming themselves, but holding the ice cubes in one hand. I have a young person I'm working with now who has a mom bought him boxing gloves and a punching bag. And when he's feeling that sort of, trauma triggering or just feeling really unregulated in terms of emotions, he goes to the basement, puts on the gloves and puts on some good music and punches that punching bag, and it just releases those feelings. Comparing to other people, and not upwards, just upwards or just downwards, but just again in perspective, to understand at the end of the day, we're all relative to other people. There are people that are suffering in ways that are beyond what we can imagine, and then there are people that seemingly aren't, but they could be going through something that we have no idea about. And to understand, especially with adolescents, because a lot of adolescents will often think they're the only ones that are insecure, and to realize, no, you're all insecure. I mean, I remember as a teenager, even the popular people, they had their insecurities. Self-soothing techniques, prayer, and that doesn't have to have a religious connotation to it. Just even the idea of just even someone being able to close their eyes and speak out loud, like, I am a good person, have good intentions, I am safe, I am secure. Just even hearing themselves say that could be very soothing as a way of tolerating distress. Relaxation techniques, deep breathing, and then all the emotional regulation skills, even just understanding and naming emotions. I mean, with trauma, sometimes it can be very difficult for people to know what they're feeling, and trying to help them name that, reducing their feelings of vulnerability, managing extreme emotions, focusing on health. And all of these things, again, are things that are tough for people with ADHD: to sleep regularly, to eat healthily. People with ADHD love sugar because sugar has a good old dopamine hit in the brain. So there's a whole body of research, which I do a lot of work in, that people with ADHD had higher risk for obesity, for impulsive eating. So we want to focus on health as that foundation, and things that people are avoiding, we want to gradually get them to not avoid that, to sort of take an opposite action, but with support. Assertiveness skills, conflict resolution skills, and negotiation. And these things can be tailored for younger people. I mean, there are a lot of models of DBT with younger people of assertiveness, as you can imagine. Again, that advocacy for ADHD and for trauma is all about self-empowerment. We want individuals to feel that they are in control of themselves, and that they don't have to be formed and dictated by sort of what happened to them, and certainly their sense of worth to feel compromised. Now, CBT also is very helpful in the treatment of this comorbidity. Just having someone be mindful for their thoughts, patterns, and assess them for evidence and accuracy. So I always tell people with cognitive therapy, it's not about turning every negative thought into a positive thought. It's turning every inaccurate thought into an accurate thought. And recognizing there's a big difference between probability and possibility. A lot of people, particularly when they're anxious, are kind of running on the possibilities of things happening versus the probability. And I won't go into so much detail, but there's a whole list of, Aaron Beck talked about the cognitive distortions, which are these patterns of thinking, like all or nothing thinking, discounting the positives. And we want to sort of identify when people fall into these traps. I should be in control of my emotions, or I'm to blame for this thing that happened to me, as opposed to really assessing the evidence and recognizing when they fall into those traps. This is a worksheet that, and with kids, I will tailor this in different ways. Sometimes we do this verbally, like what's this triggering situation? What was the feeling that they felt on a scale of 1 to 10? What was that automatic thought? And then now we're going to be lawyers now to that thought. What's the evidence for and against this? And you try to make it fun for younger people. Like, we're going to cross-examine that witness, that negative thought, and let's reframe it. And now how do we feel? And you'll see that sometimes, just even when people are able to put it in the right perspective, that their emotion starts to kind of follow suit from it. And other times so we can change the thought, which then affects the emotion. And then other times we need to just work on the behavior and the emotion and the physiology to be able to change the thought. So it can go in either way. It can be very interchangeable. Like with something like OCD, for example, the cognitive therapy is useless unless you have to start with the behavioral therapy, because people with OCD, for example, and with PTSD and having traumatic intrusive thoughts, they might know rationally, like, okay, I know I'm in the present moment, but it doesn't help. That physiology gets hijacked. So we want to teach them stress reduction techniques, things like progressive muscle relaxation, where you're tensing muscle groups and then releasing them, decreasing avoidance, exposure response prevention. But again, with trauma, it's not exposed. Don't want traumatic flooding. It's exposing people to situations that they're going to need to encounter. So if somebody has some traumatic conditioned response, let's say, to being in school, well, we want them to be back in school. We don't have to expose them to aspects of their trauma that we don't anticipate they would ever come up to, against, in terms of like some of the more graphic elements of trauma. Systematic desensitization in terms of building that hierarchy, having people confront certain situations and couple that with a lot of the deep breathing and mindfulness exercises and kind of being in the present moment. And again, all of the health hygiene, making sure and always checking in with people. How have you been sleeping? How are you eating? Are you moving? Just self-care, which is so important in people with ADHD. All the executive function demands of brushing your teeth every day. All of those things can be compromised with ADHD. And then trauma can impact that, where people sometimes feel they're not worth being taken care of. So they feel so worthless and damaged sometimes as a result of trauma. So self-care is incredibly important for both of those reasons. And the benefits of sober living. I've worked with youth as young as 8 or 9 who have already experimented with cannabis, and understanding how that is not a treatment for ADHD or PTSD, despite the cannabis industry spending millions of dollars in marketing trying to convince people that it's medicinal. Briefly, ACT, or acceptance and commitments therapy, looks at, again, acceptance, the ability of cognitive diffusion, which is, I am having this thought about my trauma versus the thought just kind of hitting someone. Being able to have distance from certain thoughts. I'm having the thought that I am worthless is very different than I am worthless. And that's what we call a diffusion technique. So now we can sort of see it as like, oh, that's just a thought, but we don't have to internalize that thought. Being present, understanding the self as context, that we are more than just this one experience. And what values do we want to gravitate to in our life, especially after a trauma? How do we integrate that trauma and continue sort of living a value-driven life? Now, when you're working with a young person, the values are, hey, I want to do well in school. I want to make friends. Absolutely. Connect, the value of connection. Let's work on that and have actions that we can commit to. From a pharmacological point of view, for PTSD, the FDA-approved medications are sertraline, paroxetine. For ADHD, stimulants and non-stimulants, but up to 30% of people with ADHD don't respond to stimulants. And there aren't studies really that look at this combined comorbidity, but clinically with patients that I work with. I don't prescribe medication, but with psychiatrists that I consult with, it really can vary depending on an individual, what the pharmacological approach could be. Some individuals with this comorbidity cannot take a stimulant. The stimulant will just trigger a lot of sort of traumatic, intrusive thoughts and obsessions about the trauma. And at the same time, I would say probably more of my patients who have this comorbidity can take a stimulant, and it indirectly helps with the PTSD because it's managing and grounding them in their ADHD. But always keeping in mind, and with young people, most of their medication is going to be managed by a parent or a caregiver. But sometimes they can forget their medication, or the caregiver can forget it. Sometimes they lose their medication, don't refill it in time. And so ADHD can show its way even in the execution of treatment. Sometimes there's stigma. Am I medicating my personality? And this is true definitely for ADHD, I hear. Sometimes people are like, I like my ADD-ness. I don't want to lose that and be a dull person. For people with PTSD, sometimes there's anger at taking medication because they feel like I shouldn't have to take this when I didn't choose to have this trauma. And so we always want to make sure we're working with that and giving people a lot of sense of community too, for both ADHD and PTSD. Support groups, hearing and bearing witness to other people's stories. And again, with trauma, it's not about hearing people's traumatic detailed stories, but just hearing stories of resilience and how people have managed and got through, how they work through those tough moments. The ADHD conference, which this year is in Baltimore at the end of the month, highly recommend for anyone with ADHD. It's not just professionals, it's parents, educators, people with ADHD. We have a good time. We do a lot of good work at this conference, and there's this real sense of humor, but it's a real strength-based model. And parents need support when their kids have ADHD, when their kids have had issues of trauma. Briefly, because I want to leave some time for questions and answers, there are also considerations for all of us as therapists. Do you have ADHD? If you do you disclose that to a patient? Now, I am a big fan and proponent of encouraging disclosure, and of course, more from the perspective of what's going to be best for the patient. I find that most patients with ADHD, I would say every patient I've worked with ADHD responds very, very well to that disclosure because they often feel misunderstood, even by other clinicians. I've had even young patients who have been like effectively fired from therapists because the therapist thought that the child or the teen wasn't motivated enough or just couldn't really do the work. They couldn't pay attention. And it's because they weren't dealing with the ADHD. What are biases and assumptions you have around ADHD? If you are not someone who, I'm definitely if you probably couldn't tell, I'm more the hyperactive end of ADHD. I can absorb that energy really well. In fact, it's very comfortable to me. But I have colleagues who are like, oh my gosh, this person is so electric in my session. I'm exhausted and drained by them. So we want to take care of ourselves too and know who can we work with. And it's okay if that's a lot for you to consider referring out, or that inattentive energy, which could be more sort of less energy in that way. Dealing with the executive functioning issues. You might have these patients that are running late because their parents might also have ADHD. With PTSD, the notion of vicarious traumatization, it's very difficult to hear about trauma. And it's very difficult to think that part of the human condition is these horrific things that human beings have to experience. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our own self-care, we're monitoring our own attitudes, and sometimes skepticism. I mean, sometimes the things that we might hear, we're like, is that possible? Could that have happened? And it's part of our own cognitive dissonance of, I know I've had those moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I almost don't want to believe that this is true because the pain that then I feel for my patient and the empathy I feel so overwhelmed by it. So we always have to make sure we're managing that. And when in doubt, get supervision, talk to fellow colleagues. We always want to assume a gentle, assertive, non-judgmental stance and create an environment for our patients of safety and consistency and flexibility, relaxing some boundaries and being firm with others. If I have, some patients when they're running late or whatnot, like, being okay. We don't want our patients to get the sense that we're annoyed by some of those things. Or if I have a patient that needs to walk around, the office, that's okay. If they need to take a break, that's okay. Being aware of transference and countertransference in both ADHD work, as well as with trauma, and with both of those, that, what role do you assume for that patient? And also what role, I know with trauma, it's very common for us to have like rescue fantasies. We want to rescue our patients from that pain and almost like take it away from them in the ways that like there could be a very parental countertransference there. So we want to sort of monitor that and make sure that we're kind of having our boundaries and monitor what's coming from the patient. With patients with ADHD, we might take on the role of a coach in some ways, where it feels very collaborative. And again, and particularly with older people, working with our policies around missed sessions and not having this sort of punishing tone. Please have your office equipped with fidget toys, soothing aids. Again, for this comorbidity, be mindful of breaks in therapy. And briefly, this is just a scenario of someone I worked with this comorbidity. He was a 45-year-old Caucasian man with a history of sexual abuse. He had vast underdiagnosed ADHD within the family and himself, history of a lot of impulsive, risky behavior. And he came to me because he had seen a webinar that I had done on ADHD. And he said, I've always been in trauma therapy and it just never really fully helped. Like there was this, I always felt like something got in the way. And an epiphany came to him when his 10-year-old son was diagnosed with ADHD. And he saw so many of his similar symptoms that he attributed to his trauma that he saw in his son, but his son didn't have a trauma history. And he's like, wait a minute, could this have been the ADHD? And at the same time, this patient was very weary of how his trauma could have intergenerationally been sort of put on his son in his own parenting, where his 10-year-old son would say, sometimes like you're all over the place, and sometimes your rules are so rigid, and other times they're kind of so loose. And so this man started to see that, his parenting of his child due to his own trauma, but also the undiagnosed ADHD, was starting to affect how his son would sort of regulate his emotions. And that for the patient who had a very low tolerance and low emotional regulation skills, was not always intentional with or able to execute what he wanted to with his son, and then would feel bad. Now, the good thing is that this man would always, after the fact, say to his son, you know what, I totally blew up, and that is not your fault. And he would feel like very guilty and painful. And so what brought him to therapy was not wanting his son to go through some of the things that, he went through, not in just in the terms of any sexual abuse, but just in a lot of this sort of emotional invalidation that my patient went through, and recognizing he was already seeing himself engage in those patterns with his son. And he said that it was very difficult to see his son have emotions because it almost brought him too close to his own traumatic feelings. And so we can see how this plays out with a lot of youth that we're working with, that sometimes what is at play for them is sometimes unresolved trauma, as well as ADHD symptoms from their parents. So I'm going to stop there, and we have about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a really informative, and certainly I want to say well-received presentation based on all the comments. We do have just a few moments for questions, so we did have a good number come in, so I'm just trying to kind of go through some of them here. But let's see. You had mentioned, a couple of things to look out for with folks with ADHD. There came a question here in terms of, do you also encourage those with ADHD to see their strengths? So I guess more a matter of reframing. So for example, sensitivity to the external world and others can be a challenge, but also an asset. And I think you spoke a little bit to that, but wondering if you can say a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that was a question, and the first question, because 100% that, one of the things, like when we talk about sensitivity and that word, and especially for boys that I work with, that word almost has this like pejorative, like, and sometimes, I mean, people with ADHD are told like you're too sensitive, as if it's this bad thing. And to say, hey, wait a minute, let's put this in perspective. We also know that folks with ADHD score higher in empathy. And there's a term that we use in the ADHD community called justice sensitivity, that a lot of kids with ADHD are really feel very strongly about injustice. And I was definitely one of those kids. I remember very clearly, I grew up in the 70s and 80s when the miniseries Roots was on, being horrified when I understood sort of, our history of slavery, learning about the Holocaust. I was a huge animal rights activist when I was a teenager. And for a hot minute before I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, it was either a drummer in a punk band or it was an attorney but if I was an attorney, I was going to fight for the underdog. I was a short, skinny kid who would insert myself in situations that if anyone was bullied or being mistreated, I couldn't even help myself. I mean, it was impulsive, even to the detriment. I mean, sometimes friends would be like, "You don't want to be doing that. You're going to get yourself, killed." But there is that empathy, and I always tell the kids I work with, if only everybody was wired that way, man, would this place be this world would be a much better place. But we have to regulate that, because I knew my experience as a kid is knowing, thankfully, because music was such a big part of my life and my family, I didn't reject emotion because I thought, well, songwriters have to be in touch with their emotions. So I don't want to totally let go of this, but I knew instinctively I have to figure out a way. And I remember, I'm a very visual thinker. I remember doing this with my hands, under my dining room table with my headphones on, listening to ABBA. When I was a kid, thinking I need like a screen to let the emotions come in more, because I felt bowled over by them. And that's what we want to tell our kids. I also say to my son, who's now in college, but when he was 6, it was clear he had ADHD in the womb. I diagnosed him, but he also has dyslexia. And when he was 6, and I said, look, his favorite show is Shark Tank. And for those of you who might not know, 3 of the sharks, Kevin O'Leary, Damon Johns, Barbara Corcoran, have dyslexia. Mark Hershevek, I think is his last name, has ADHD. And I said, that's not accidental. In fact, there's a professor at Syracuse University in the business school that is studying the connection of ADHD and entrepreneurship, that having ADHD, when you naturally think outside the box, that gives ways to innovation. That gives ways to creative problem solving, provided, though, that the ADHD is being managed. And that's the most important thing, because we can't get to those places unless we're getting the right support and treatment that we need. But 100%, I always want people to take away the strength base. I love my ADHD brain. And at the same time, don't get me wrong, it has been the source of frustration and of puzzlement in my life. And at the same time, I wouldn't change it for anything in the world.
Great, thank you. So I'll get a couple of questions. Maybe we have time for 1 or 2. So I think you talked about some of the indicators around ADHD, but also when it comes to children, how would you bring it up to parents? And you kind of touched a little bit about this in terms of sort of, bringing in the perspective of the family, any sort of cultural norms. So anything else you might want to add, or some of the language that, you might suggest folks use?
Definitely. I think it's very important with parents, because, as we know, with parents, we want the best for our children, and we are as happy as our least happy child. And so we always want to present it by first saying, this label, this name of ADHD, to look at it as this sort of beginning and openness of something, that this now avails us to resources and ways that we can now help your child get what they need. This is not in any way an indictment of your parenting. In fact, and I would often have a strength-based approach to parents to say, ADHD, like, this could be a far worse situation for your child if it were not for your love and your support and the security and the safety that you bring, your child, because it could really go down, when ADHD is really not taken care of in ways, can go down other paths. So to emphasize what the parent has been doing well that is helping that child in that way, and to say, this is, and then when I explain to them what it is, and a lot of times when parents are like, oh, that makes sense. And particularly for moms who like kids with ADHD, for example, are very poor sleepers. We're more likely to have colic when we're younger. We're more likely to have ear infections. We're more likely to be difficult to soothe. I was a kid that did not want to go to sleep at night. And and a lot of times when I say this to parents, I'm like, this is like, they were kind of born into the world. It can actually be relieving to be like, oh my gosh, and all along I thought I was such a bad parent that, why were my friends, kids able to breastfeed so easily? And for me, it was just impossible. They would just, or to change their diaper, they were flipping all over the table. And I thought, or I was, blaming myself when my kid couldn't sit still in the gymnastics class. And then to also address any concerns, because sometimes culturally, like I've had parents say, is this going to be on their report card? Will this follow them? Is this going to stigmatize them? And to allay those concerns and to say, no, in fact, what we want to see this diagnosis is an opening so that it's going to get them sort of on the right path in that kind of way. And sometimes it's also coaching parents as to how they talk about that with family, because sometimes if the parents might be fine with it, but they're like, oh, like I'm getting so much crap from family members who are like, oh, your kid shouldn't be on medication. They're going to be addicted to it. All these myths and misperceptions. What do they share with other people if they decide to? And
I appreciate that. Yeah.
And definitely giving parents community and lending them resources to talk to other parents who have kids with ADHD.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you spoke around shame and for folks that have been diagnosed with ADHD, but also that support around them. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I am cognizant of time. I do want to just remind folks, our CTAC coordinator did put in a link for a post feedback survey. Please take the time to fill that out. Again, it helps us to making sort of improvements, really tailoring to what your training and technical assistance needs are. We have another offering in December, and we have another offerings actually in the works that we have not announced yet, but be on the lookout for those on your email, your inbox. Later on today, we actually will be releasing the first episode of the new offering, a CTAC podcast, Voices from the Field, a podcast for practitioners by practitioners. You should have gotten an email some time ago. We'll send out reminders in about a couple of weeks from now, but we have our annual feedback survey. So again, really looking back at, as we think of future offerings, what are those things, how can we help to support the work that you do in supporting children, youth, and families? And I guess just very lastly, again, from the comments that came in, very well received presentation. So I want to thank you, Dr. Oliveira, for your presentation. I want to thank the audience for joining us. For those of you that are looking for CEs, just as a reminder, registration is open tomorrow, but you will be receiving a detailed email with all the information and links that you need within the next 2 to 3 business days, along with a posting of the recording and slides to our website. Any questions, obviously, feel free to reach out to us at ctalk.info@nyu.edu. And with that, again, I do want to say thank you to everyone that has joined us and have a great rest of the day. Thank you all.